I'm Ibrahim Sundiata, Emeritus Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University outside Boston, and former chair of the History Department at Howard University, and a graduate of Northwestern University outside Chicago, and a native of, I rarely say this, a native of Painesville, Ohio, which is somewhere near Cleveland, I believe.
It is. It's one of our suburbs. So I'm in a suburb too. Yes. I'm in Cleveland Heights. So it's
okay.
It's very good. So we're going to speak mostly about your article 1619 and the Myth of Return, which was published last year in Transition Magazine. So if you could maybe kind of introduce us to the topic and why you wrote the article, what it was about.
Okay. Let me just say something about the magazine, because I just finished reading it. Get some facts and figures. It's published by the Hutchins Center at Harvard. And it's been there for a long time, and it's distributed, published, printed at University of Indiana. And the head, I guess the honorary head, well, it has various heads, including Skip Gates. Now, when I was really thrilled in August of 2019, when I heard about 1619, I thought, wow, as a historian and an African-American, and an animal, you get the whole, there would be from the 400 years of history tied together. As I read it, though, because it is written as separate articles, as most people, some articles I liked, some articles I didn't like. And then there were anachronisms. There were things that weren't true at the time. So I would read something. So first I really liked it, then I read it. Then I thought, I like this piece. I don't like this piece. This piece could damage. For instance, if you say that the cause of the American Revolution, one of the main causes, you say they've changed it, but they said one of the main causes was British emancipation. And I thought, that's not really true. British emancipation starts after the American War of Independence. And the first place on the planet, I often ask people who are deeply imbricated, use a fancy word, in 1619, what was the first place on the planet that I know of to abolish slavery? And they go, well, and actually the first place is up the road, Vermont, before the war had ended. I'm not talking about it. I'm not talking about Quakers in 1688. I'm talking about actual laws. But there may have been very few slaves in Vermont, but that's, so as I read, I was thinking about 1619 and what was the world like in 1619, and the world was cruel and messy and ugly by our standards. So as I was reading about the cruelty, this extreme cruelty, which came through to me in Virginia, I was thinking this cruelty wasn't invented in Virginia. This cruelty came out of a class system and a system of hierarchy, which we basically, there's no reason 1619 should explain the year 1619 to us. But we have to realize that the cruelty, those horrible cruelties practiced on enslaved Africans were already in practice, some of them. If you were a Jesuit priest in England in 1619, you could be whipped through the streets, naked, hanged until you were almost dead, cut down, your belly cut open, castrated, and drawn and quartered. Now that was the law. So it's a cruel time in which Africans are put into this cruel society of this kind of new colony with all kinds of English people, some high, some low. It's struggling, and they're put into the situation where they are this 20-odd people are the beginning, the seed of a horrible system. Now, one of the things also I didn't like about 1619 was this boat wasn't going to Virginia. Virginia is not part of the story. There were over 20,000 slaves, not in Virginia, but in a place called Veracruz, which is in Mexico. And the ship that was taking these people away from Africa was going to Veracruz. And oftentimes we have an American narrative, we put ourselves at the center and we don't ask the right questions. And then sometimes we look silly. Less than 5% of the slaves in the Atlantic slave trade came to the United States. 30% went to Brazil. But if I say, so it's like 95% of the people are going someplace else. Like those people, some of the people who arrived in Jamestown had cousins or brothers or mothers or lovers in Veracruz. And so I'm thinking to myself, it's a kind of truncated story. It focuses on our story, which is part of a larger story. The war against the British wasn't exactly a war against slavery, because the British abolished slavery over 50 years later. So it's a lot. If they were planning, most people didn't live that long. So someone who was an adult in 1776 was not looking forward to Jubilee and freedom because the British didn't give it. The British had a bit, I'm an Anglophile. I think they did a great thing when Parliament abolished slavery, but it wasn't until 1833, 34. It's a ways away from 1776. So I read that part and it was put forward so forcefully, that this was one of the impetuses, that Jefferson and these people were afraid the British were going to abolish slavery. Well, Jefferson and Adams and most of those people were dead. It didn't happen in their lifetimes. So that started me thinking about writing an article, the one you read, on, I'm writing now a book called After 1619, and mentioning all the things I like about the work, and then things that we need to flesh out. And I want to come back to something at the very end. So ask me about my end point. I have 1619 leaves out something very important. But I used to tell my students, and they always, flinched. I used to say, slavery is like marriage. It's a universal institution. So often people will say to me, well, when did slavery start? And I say, well, we don't know, because writing hadn't been invented. If it's in the middle Neolithic, we don't have writing. We have evidence that some people controlled other people. We have evidence that some people forced other people to do things, that we have evidence of some hierarchy, but we don't have writing. By the time you get to, historical big time, Nebuchadnezzar, you have codes, you have, this slave gets this slave this, a female slave gets this. We have that. And that's 5,000 years ago. So most people say to me, well, when did, you know what I mean, Professor? I'll go ahead and tell me, African slavery. I'll say, well, African slavery, do you mean slavery going out of Africa or slavery inside Africa? Because Africans are human beings and have hierarchy, there was slavery in Africa itself. And oftentimes it looked like European serfdom. People could work themselves out of it. Oftentimes the favored slaves, that people wanted to have slaves, or societies wanted to have slaves, who were women, because women were farmers. And so a woman, in my article, I quote, I met a slave trader, an old man, and I was in my 20s, I actually met a slave trader. And he was, he wouldn't do all these filters we have now. He just said, I said, what did you do to the people? And he said, well, the young girls are pretty, we married them, we incorporated them. What did you do with the young men? Well, we sold them if we could. And, and I'm taking notes, and then we had a primitive recording things, right? And then he said, I said, what about the others? He said, we killed them. Now, and we still have I have the recording, I have my field notes. I didn't fall out. I didn't suddenly try to beat him to death. And what I say in my article, it was as if I had met some old guy in Chicago who'd run drugs, women, and booze and prohibition. Not the kind of person I want to hang around with, but certainly an interesting testimony, because he was not feeling guilty about it. It was a business. as that man in Chicago, that old man in Chicago who would have been 90 with me coming up, might have said to me. So what I did, there's slavery in Africa, and there is a theory that once Europeans got involved with taking people away, then people had more value, and so wars increased. This was, in some places, this did happen. In other words, you give someone a value which they didn't have before. Before, they can be farmers, they can be soldiers. Now they can be sold overseas, and you can trade these people for tobacco, rum, and guns, right? But there was already slavery. It changes, it morphs, it gets worse. Now someone said, well, where did it start? I said, well, okay, I tried to get to that. We don't know exactly where it started. Where did it start with Africans going overseas? And about 4 years ago, I went with a group of African Americans. I belong to an association, USWO, and we were going to go to the place where it all started. And so, like, I'm actually going to the place where the first African slaves arrived in Europe. And it's an anticlimactic story. We got on the bus in southern Spain, in Seville, and we were going to a place called Sagres in Portugal, which is where supposedly the first enslaved persons arrived from sub-Saharan Africa. Well, the bus broke down. We didn't get there. A bunch of very unhappy people. I was less unhappy than the other people. It was a little bonus. We stopped in a very small town. We went to a dungeon, and it was the Inquisition's dungeon. And to see what was being done to Jews and to Muslims before the slave trade, it was fun. It was a very spooky place. But anyway, we didn't get there. But what happens is in the 1400s, the Portuguese begin going down the African coast. And they know there's something out there. This whole thing about Columbus wasn't a good sailor. Well, Columbus, like many Portuguese or Spaniards or Genoese, knew there was something out there. The Azores, Madeira, the Cape Verdes, the Canaries. So already Europeans are raising sugar on these islands like Madeira, which is Portuguese. They know that they can raise sugar, and so they're bringing in slaves. And the first sub-Saharan slaves arrive in 1444. And it's not, often we project back. Well, what they want people. So what the Portuguese will do is they will use criminals, Portuguese criminals. This is not Mississippi 1850. John C. Calhoun would turn over in his grave. These are white people, or condenados, condemned ones. You committed a capital offense, the king in his mercy can give you your life for as long as you last on the sugar plantation in Madeira. Others are, and then someone wrote me about a novel, and I said, well, I don't know that much about it, and I can't recommend your novel. But others were Jewish children, orphans whose parents had been eliminated by the Holy Office, also known as the Inquisition. Others, third group, were non-believers, were Muslim North Africans, Moroccans. And according to the popes, they could be several decisions, and one in 1453, I believe, by Nicholas V. You can enslave non-Christians. He meant Muslim, by the way. It just turned out there are a lot of other kinds of people. So what happens is you begin to have this mixed labor force on a place like the Canaries, and then Columbus left from the Canary Islands. So we're dealing with this mixed labor force, and then there are people who are no longer with us. The Guanches, which I didn't mention very much. But the reason I didn't, well, I should have mentioned them maybe more, is the Guanches are exterminated. They were genocided. The Portuguese and the Spanish began to visit the Canaries in the Middle Ages, still the Middle Ages, those is like 1300s, early 1400s. And they discovered these people were quite white, very white, light hair, light eyes, but very little clothing, dressed in goatskin shoes, Maine wealth goats, different little tribelets. And the Spanish come in with horses and armor. Guns haven't been invented yet. They do have crossbows, which are quite effective against human flesh that tear apart. And they enslave the Guanches. And we have lists, slave list. Going to Seville, you know, how many Guanches? And what happens is, because I think if you think about 1619 and all at the beginning of this horror, the horror goes back before. If you look at the slave registers, the list, right? The number of Guanches goes down and down and down and down. And by the 1530s, guess what? They're none. They're gone. Now, their color didn't protect them. Think that, you know, Ferdinand and Isabel like, oh, those poor naked people on an island who don't know Christ. No. The Pope says you can enslave them. So, in fact, two popes have said at least that you can enslave. What happens though, as the Portuguese go down Africa, eventually the workforce becomes African and becomes black. So that by 1530, an island we've never heard of called Sao Tome, St. Thomas, it's one near Africa, 350 miles off the coast of the Republic of Congo. And so the Portuguese are there, they're raising sugar, they're getting people from the coast, and the people they're getting from the coast are black. And once one of my students said, well, Africans were made for that kind of work. And I go, no, Africans weren't made for that kind of work. Around 1900, there's a slavery scandal on Sao Tome. People died. And a colleague of mine at UVA, Joe Miller, wrote a book. The subtitle was Way of Sugar, Way of Death. These little places killed thousands and thousands of people. Now, unfortunately for us, and it's not in 1619, you know, it's not there, and it's can't do everything. It's about the US. But what happened was, well, I can say unfortunately, but is history unfortunate? Yeah, well, I'll say unfortunately, but something happened. No, I won't editorialize. The Portuguese ran into a place called Brazil. And they already have Sao Tome. And they already have Madeira. So they already have slaves. They already have a little system, right? They have these little islands and system. And they took that system to Brazil, which becomes this huge plantation. It's a country bigger than the US without Alaska. It's big. And it imports people and it disposes of people. So let's say by 1530, Brazil has a slave trade, maybe even before. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, 1888. My grandfather was alive. So that we're part of the story, but we have to realize it's part of an interconnected story. And that the year I was born, which I won't say, a very famous historian, Eric Williams, said, and he was a firebrand, he was a black firebrand, he was a Marxist. He said, when the British abolished slavery, it had nothing to do with goodness, you know, it was economic, okay. But he also said that all the hands that touched the slave trade were white and black and red and brown. He said that. And this had to do with class oppression. He was, I think, I never met him, but I have a feeling he was rather crusty. You know, he was attacking British liberals who said, oh, you know, we were so Christian, we abolished the slave trade. You know, Christianity had nothing to do with it. No, I think that's an exaggeration, but that was his point. But his point was that this was a system in which Africans and Native Americans and Euro-Americans participated, but not at the same degree, right? There were some Africans who were corrupt, who were benefiting from a corrupt system. So I thought about that, and I didn't get that from 1619. That's why I'm writing a book about it. And the other thing about 1619 was I sort of really much more attuned with Barack Obama, who has this idea of evolutionary progress in terms of human rights. I don't think that most people anywhere in the world in 1619 believed in what I believe in human rights. I could be wrong, but I don't think that was true anywhere. And so I think we go through a series of struggles, struggle after struggle after struggle after struggle. And the struggle did not begin in 1619. And I do disagree with the person who wrote 1619, the American Narrator, said all the struggles begin with Black folk. So the union struggle begins with Black folk. Well, no, there were unions. There were attempts at 19th century unions. Suffragism begins with Black. No, they may have been racist or old biddies, whatever bad thing we want to say about the suffragists. But they had a cause. There are many causes which move us forward. And Barack Obama said that his becoming president wasn't into racism, but it was another step in the struggle. He was the result of struggle, and he was standing on the shoulders of giants. But that struggle all included unionization, it included women voting, it included so many things. It wasn't that, nothing happened until 1619 or 1965. That's not true. Now we're not there. We still have the struggle. We still got that struggle. And I agree with him. So I quote him, at the end, because he was saying the Black story is not a story we should be ashamed of, but is part of a universal story for universal human rights. And that's very different than what's being said in 1619. It is. Just, what he's saying is very different than the tone of 1619. Now, I don't know how much time I have.
You're going to say, as long as you want, you can have.
Right. Well, don't say that. don't say that. I got to eat dinner tonight.
Yeah, exactly.
But the other thing is, this will be fairly brief. There's something missing in 1619. I read the book. I bought the book. I mean, I read the series, obviously, and I bought the book. And then the book, excoriates Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, it excoriates Abraham Lincoln more than it excoriates Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, or Jefferson Davis, or John C. Calhoun. I can think of a lot of really, 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 really evil men in 19th century America. And excuse me for using this word. No, I'm not going to say the N word. We'll call a nigger a nigger. Okay? And would say that slavery, universal slavery forever. Someone like John C. Calhoun. Well, somehow, and then we get to Lincoln, and Lincoln is ambiguous, and therefore he's not quite right. Well, my whole thing was, since Lincoln is a, bourgeois politician trying to get elected, in some of his statements, he's speaking to an all-white male electorate in Southern Illinois. I'm not equating him with John C. Calhoun. I'm sorry. And if you don't know who Calhoun is, you need to look him up, because Calhoun would say, I want slavery forever. In fact, someone like Calhoun, who was one Secretary of State, said one day the US flag will fly at the mouth of the Mississippi and at the mouth of the Amazon. The Americas would be captured for slavery. And I wouldn't be here, nor would the other talking heads I see on TV. I mean, African-American talking heads. That is a horrible world. Can you imagine a world of universal slavery, African slavery? So sometimes, I was seeing various people sort of slapped around, and actually went to a library meeting in my own town at the beginning, and I just wanted to see how lay people, reacted, and there was discussion. And it was mentioned that Lincoln was in favor of immigration, which is part of the new book. He was in favor of immigration. And an elderly woman, and I could say that because she was older than I, She had a few years on me, elderly white woman. And she said, the leader of the group saying, he favored immigration. He wasn't this great man. And she whispered, well, she didn't whisper, she hissed, but she wasn't ordinary. Asked. And I thought, okay, I'm here to get reactions. I'm writing it down. I'm not going to do the lay group. But I'm thinking there are a lot of bastards in the 19th century. and he's not anywhere near my top list of racial bastards. But the thing was that 1619 then leaves out one of the most important movements in African American history. Someone would argue the most important movement, because it's put together by people who are aggrieved integrationists. They don't say they're integrationists, and they're upset that it never happened. It hasn't happened. Schools are more segregated now than ever. But one of the things that was left out, if I would not know, reading 1619, what was the largest movement of African Americans ever, I wouldn't know it. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, the biggest, bigger than the NACP, SNCC, bigger than the Nation of Islam, bigger, the biggest, not mentioned. And because one of the things he was for is immigration. His whole thing was that doing the same thing constantly and getting the same result is probably the proof of mental illness. He said, he would say in 1922, you're going to be doing the same thing 100 years ago. You're going to be praying for integration, and it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And so he said, what we have to do, and this is going to sound very strange, and it's very politically incorrect. He said, everyone deserves a nation. And he says, he's very pro-Indian independence. Let the Indians have their own state. And the Irish Free State, it was called. Let the Irish have their state. And also, the Jews deserve a state. I mean, he was very, they deserve a state. They realize, or at least the Zionists realize, that you can beg and complete, but things can get worse. They kept saying, if you think things, this is like 1922, right? If you think things can get worse for them, what makes you think that things won't get worse for us? Now, millions of people, briefly, millions, the largest black movement said it had 5 million members. I don't know that. But millions of African Americans at least read the newspaper, the Negro World. And it's the end, it's not the end because we still have immigrationism, but before Garvey, there was a man that I had to study in school, and things, they're fashion. So when I was in school, there was a man called Edward Wilmot Blyden. And we read about him, and we studied Blyden. Blyden's not mentioned at all in 1619. Why? Blyden was an immigrationist. He came to this country from the Danish West Indies to study at a place called Rutgers. And they didn't have snapshots. So he shows up, he gets off the train, he goes to the admissions office, and there he is. And they're like, yes, you're Edward Wilmot Blyden. We don't accept Negroes. And he goes and then is taken in by a church. He's basically homeless. He's taken in by a church, and he's approached by the American Colonization Society, and he goes. He spends the rest of his life writing about the need to immigrate, or something horrible is going to happen. And he comes back. I mean, he goes on lectures tour. He comes back. He doesn't just stay there. He comes back and he says, really, if you can have Europeans carving out colonies, why not have a place where the Black people of the West, meaning the United States, and the Black people of the East, meaning come together and build a society? Because you're going to be asking for equality, and it's not going to come. Now, he said this from like the 1850s, and he died in 1912. And he's an influence on Garvey. And before that, that's Martin Delaney, who was an immigrationist in the 1850s. And all these guys were very militant. There's Campbell, Delaney, there's a whole list of them. And it's not that they're tools of Abraham Lincoln or tools of the Colonization Society. Many of them don't like it. They just want out. They want a place where they can construct a society free of American racism. And that whole chain, because when I was in school, we had courses on both nationalism, and these, we had the, thank God I remember some of it. And I remember reading about Blyden, and of course, Garvey, and I wrote a book about Garvey. So, but there were many, and these were firebrands. These were the people who were really considered radical. Now, they were pessimists. They said 150 years from now, 100 years from now, it will not be solved. And then by the time you get to Garvey, Garvey's saying, we have an example. Zionism. Now, I know people would go crazy. Now, I know people like, he was really off base. That was a horrible example. But that's one of his examples. The other one was in Ireland, where the British had been there 800 years, not 400 years, 800 years. And it had been a hard 800 years, hard. A million people died in the 1840s. Of starvation, sort of planned. I mean, the British were exporting food and people were dying. India, we said all those people being ruled by this little white minority. So he was very much, after World War I, everyone should get their share, their fair share, and a nation, because he was a nationalist. Now, he's not in 1619. You can read, and I think his name is mentioned once, but it's like, he had a movement. Who was it? And I found that unfortunate, since his movement was the biggest, and it had offshoots. It was very secular. It didn't say God's going to send the wind. I mean, after it, quote, failed with help from the FBI, many people turned to religion, right? And so we get the Nation of Islam. And then God, God was going to do it, and the white devil will disappear. Garvey's not like that. Garvey says, some of my best friends are white. I mean, he actually says at some point, well, some of my biggest enemies are black. He does say, and that we're going to do it with cement. We're going to do it with tractors. We're going to do it with steamships. There's no divine wind that's going to carry us back to Africa. And maybe, and he also says, I'm not saying everyone should go. I'm not saying, you said some people are no good here, they'll be no good there. I'm saying, but some part of us should go. Now, so I found that an emission that I didn't like, that I thought was major. And at the same time, I think by having 1619, we have discussions, it promotes discussion. And that's beautiful, because we wouldn't be, without that, we wouldn't be having this discussion. And African history, African-American history would be on the back burner, or it would only come up on MLK Day, even though we say it's all year, every year, it should be all year. But then or when the horrible killing of George Floyd, then we talk about it. But we need to talk about it all the time. And my last thing, this will be the last thing. Basically, it seemed to me that 1619 was looking at stations on the cross, stations on the cross. In other words, it's a series of atrocity tales. Most people don't tell their stories that way. And two scholars at Princeton came up with, they studied various groups. And most groups puff themselves up, even if it's not true. And they interviewed Sean Puffy Combs, who says, we don't have any history. We had slavery, then we had civil rights and water hoses. We don't have anything. And if you're reading a series of atrocity stories, people are not making love. You don't mention much. They're not making music. They're not making culture. And to realize for most of those people, these atrocities are things that happen, but they're things which don't define them. We're not the sum total of our oppression. We are more than a problem. We are more than a problem. And so also, I was reading the other day, two things happened. I was reading Randall Kennedy, who's a law scholar at Harvard, an African-American, and he had a description from 1852 of a law, not the exclusion law, but it was the first law about attorneys. And it says they're so much worse than Negroes. They breed like rabbits. And it goes on and on and on. And it's vile. So, you know, we have Negroes already. We don't need this yellow peril, this human garbage, this refuse. Now, I don't think there's any, I could be wrong, because there are schools in California and other places where middle-class Chinese children go and learn about, you know, Ming vases and Jung poetry, okay? And about the great voyages of the 15th century by the Chinese. But I don't think they learn, I don't think they get this stuff. You know, I mean, I don't think they get this stuff. I think that it's very interesting because the person's writing the book talked about Nigerians, you know, in the United States, who come and they have cultural associations for the kids, and the kids learn, let's say, the Yoruba, DuBois, founder, was this great man, you know, Lebanese kids going to school, kids go to Jewish school. The Holocaust is not the whole of Jewish existence. It's not. It's a very important, but it's not the whole. If it were, you can think about it. We only had that thing, and you didn't mention anything else. So I think by reducing African-American history to a series of tales of woe, leaving out the connective tissue, and sort of saying, as Eric Williams would have said, or some other people would have said, you know, or Robeson would have said, this is a part of a shared suffering, which is human. I know that sounds hokey now. That we lose a lot, because what you're having is you're basically saying, my group is so exceptional, everyone hates us. You know, we're the kid in the class. Our mother dresses us funny, and we can't talk straight. And that's not true. We're not that kid. And then you lose some of the richness of the texture of what was happening, what happened before the slave trade, because most people, you know, don't have much idea. I mean, the Atlantic slave trade. And I'll leave you with this. It's frustrating sometimes. I have a relative, a new relative, a lovely person. And this is going to, vignette is always good, I guess, to end on, but this is vignette. One young person in the family said that she was Sierra Leonean. And so other people in the family said, that's stupid, Sierra Leonean. Yeah. Just an ordinary African-American. And she had said, so I was curious because they were sort of mocking her. They were talking about her, she was not present. So then I said, well, why would she say that? And so I spoke to my cousin, he's like my brother. And I said, well, why would she say that? And he said, well, our surname, his surname is a name that he was on a plane, he met the pilot, and he and the pilot had the same surname. So this is what is frustrating, but also encouraging. So I go, okay, could be. Because Sierra Leone, Freetown, was founded in 1787 by the Black Poor from Britain, and then people from the United States, by Canada, Black loyalists, some 3,000 of them, go up to Nova Scotia and then over to Freetown. It's quite possible. And some people got left behind and ended up in Maryland and Virginia. You see where I'm going with this? And so this name was the name of a legal family. So, you know, they become lawyers and blah, blah, blah. And this man had actually talked to my cousin and said, you know, maybe we're related. Anyway, the new member of the family said, no, that's not true. How could that be true? And, you know, we don't have anything to do with those Africans. Maybe because of my work. And then she said, I said, well, trying to talk quickly, this very quickly, it's very hard. I said, but in the American War of Independence, the majority of Black men who fought for the British, and then were evacuated. And she said, I don't believe you. The British are so racist. And I gave up, you know, because I would have had it. And then I said later on to her new son-in-law, I said, where do you think the Underground Railway ended up? Grand Central? I think a place called Canada. Oh, really? You know, and so at some point it becomes very frustrating. I mean, it's a teachable moment, but the thing is how to get the sound bite in there, because a whole group of people, this whole thing that could be true, and I'm not going to study it. I would need, you know, 3 graduate students. You find this name in the Book of Negroes, as it was called, from 1783, and then find the ones who were in the South, and then find, you know, it's possible. But what I was getting is, we didn't leave anything in Africa. Don't come in here talking about those Africans. And then, you know, you're frustrated and said, well, let me explain. And then it was, well, the British didn't take any people. They're just racist. I'm saying, well, they're racist and racist. Yes, I agree. But then I realized I didn't have enough time. And so I basically, then later on, a few days, such a new son-in-law, her new son-in-law, where do you think the Underground Railway ended up? He says, I don't know. You know, and I realized that they're teachable moments. So I'm writing a book called After 1619, which will have these thoughts, mention Black nationalism, mention that the other thing is most groups glorify themselves in ways that are puffery and true, but only African Americans really say we are the least among these. Which is interesting and sad. I mean, it's not just interesting, but it has consequences. And they study kids. Like, if you teach kids that, it's probably not the best thing for them. Like kids who've been in refugee camps in Sudan. I mean, you can really, saying you're the lowest of the low really doesn't improve ambition that much. And I think I'll stop on that note. This has been interesting. It's been an interesting day.
And thank you. And it's really nice because what you were talking about was, you know, one of the things that the 1619 project did was it launched this ongoing discussion group. And this group has been able to drop in topics as things happen. So, you know, we did a 3-month deep dive into policing, you know, in the United States. And it was, you know, had very little to do with the actual 1619 project as it was. But, you know, we looked at slave traders down to, you know, the prison industrial complex as it happens today. So it's been this wonderful structure, like kind of skeleton that we can then flesh in. And for that, I'm incredibly.
Like I said, I'm so happy it happened.
Yes.
Right. We had these discussions. Yeah. Without it, you know, I wouldn't be, I'd be doing something.
Right. Yeah. So it's fascinating. And again, I thank you so much for your time and your work. And I'm going to read your book on Garvey because he's always been a fascinating figure to me. And I read one book many years ago about him, and it was really highly.
Well, I'm hoping to reissue it. It's coming. It's always been in print. So 2023 will be the 20th anniversary, and I hope to. And I didn't do any press on it. It's a long story.
Yeah.
I was going, and so I probably will do that because some of the things he's ambiguous. He's very ambiguous, and also today perhaps radioactive because of beliefs.